Hello, sports bettors and soccer fans. My name is Michael Leboff. I am the co-host of Wonder Goal, the soccer betting podcast from the Action Network, and joining me today to give out some of our best practices when it comes to betting on the World Cup are my co-hosts, friends, colleagues, Anthony DeBundo and BJ Cunningham. BJ, I'm going to start with you. The World Cup is upon us. Handicapping international soccer tournaments is very unique. It's quite different from handicapping a regular soccer match between two club teams, say Brighton and Brentford. What would be your first message to someone who's coming into the World Cup a little green when it comes to, betting international soccer and frankly betting the World Cup?
Yeah, so betting international soccer, like you said, is very unique. What we have is essentially teams coming or countries coming together that essentially don't play with each other that often. And what tends to happen is these teams tend to be a little bit more conservative and they tend to play more defensive because they haven't been in training together very long. They, aren't very well drilled, whether it be with pressing or, quick transitions and everything like that. So these matches tend to be a little bit more low event and they tend to favor the underdog, especially on the spread. Now, that's not saying some of the bigger nations can't get margin or they can't, beat teams on the spread. But the reality is that we've seen from international tournaments over and over again is that the biggest nations, while they tend to end up winning these tournaments on an individual match basis, they struggle to cover spreads and they struggle to cover overs. So what I would tell people is that a lot of the expected goals data is kind of wonky. What one thing I like to do when I'm going through a lot of these nations is I like to say, okay, who are the best teams that they've played leading up to the World Cup, whether it be in Asia, Africa, CONCACAF, CONMEBOL. If let's just say Tunisia is playing Denmark, well, I want to know exactly who the best teams they played, whether it be, Mali and Nigeria. How did they play against them in the Africa Cup of Nations or in African qualifying? That is what I would tell people is tend to focus on when these teams have played their best competition and how they've played against them rather than, let's say England beating San Marino 10-0. That doesn't really matter up until this point. So that's what I would tell people. These international tournaments tend to favor the underdogs. They tend to favor unders just because these teams just don't have a lot of training together and they have to be a little bit more defensive and a little bit more compact so that they can stay in these matches because it is a knockout tournament, right? Like there's only 3 matches in the group stage. So teams tend to be a little bit more conservative than at the club level where teams have 38 matches over a season and they can be more aggressive.
Anthony, I think BJ brings up a good point, which is a lot of the data that we tend to use on Wonder Goal, whether it's expected goals, big scoring chances, pressure data, all that stuff. It's not that you should straight up ignore it, but you have to give it context in international soccer because these teams play together so infrequently. And like BJ said, they're playing against competition that like San Marino or Estonia in meaningless matches. So what I guess is a good question would be like, what is the market missing? What do you think the market underrates when it comes to international soccer? Is it like chemistry, cohesion, managerial stuff? What do you think where is there an edge for a bettor to gain on the market? Because it might be something that these algorithms that are producing these lines are missing.
Yeah, I think sometimes what teams have done at past tournaments can be a little bit overrated in a sense. So you'll see teams that maybe did really well at past tournaments, but have fallen off, or maybe, and this is one reason why we like to use age profiles. We're trying to figure out which team might be teetering on the edge of falling off, and we just don't know it yet because we haven't seen them play enough games together lately. So you look at certain teams, like, for example, in this tournament, a Belgium or a Croatia, where they're on the older side. We saw them perform at the Euros. They were okay, but not great. Then they played a handful of matches in the Nations League where they were, again, okay, but not great. A ton of time passes since then, a few months. Where is the potential for a team that's either on the rise or on the fall where the market may not have properly priced them? I think that you can kind of get at that a little bit. Tactical matchups are really important. Which managers set their teams up best? Which teams can play multiple different ways to match up with different opponents? I think is something you have to consider. And also, I think recent form is something that does matter, and history has shown that it matters. This is from The Athletic, but 21st century champions of the World Cup, so that's the last 5 or 6 World Cups, those teams average 11.6 points from their 5 pre-tournament games. If you were to give 3 points for a win, 1 point for a draw, there's only 5 teams in this tournament that fit that criteria, and it's Brazil, who won all 5, Argentina, who won 4 and drew 1, the Netherlands, who also had 13 points, Spain, and Uruguay. So those 5 teams are kind of the informed teams. And history suggests that teams don't perform that well when they're out of form. Teams like England, the US, and Mexico and Germany to a lesser extent don't tend to perform that well, France included. The question is, of course, how do you weight that with the fact that now we have the Nations League where these teams are playing against other quality opponents that are around them in talent, but in games that aren't all that meaningful, given that they happened right after a long club season. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty with this World Cup, especially because it's in the middle of the season and not at the end. It's in the desert. We don't know the weather conditions exactly, but we know it's going to be hot. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty to kind of, parse through, but it definitely is more art than it is science. As much as we care about the numbers, there's so much changing of players and managers and lack of data that you have to kind of treat this like an art and figure out, okay, which team is on the rise, which team has cohesiveness, which team is kind of just an assemblance of parts and is not prepared necessarily to, gel together at the right time.
BJ, we talk a lot on our Wonder Goal preview pods about sleepers, dark horses in this tournament. What boxes do you want your potential underdogs, a live underdog, a team that can pull an upset, a team that could go on a run? What boxes are you looking for them to tick that makes you excited to bet them?
Well, I think it's something Anthony mentioned. It's cohesion, right? So a lot of these teams who essentially have had the same core for a long time, if their age profile is still sitting pretty well, I want teams that know the tactics they're going to play, have been playing under the manager for a long time. A team like a Denmark or a Switzerland who know exactly what they want to do. And like Anthony mentioned, can play multiple different styles as an underdog when they have to play some of the bigger nations, teams who have proven it against bigger nations over that long run, like those 2 type of teams. Those are the type of teams I get excited to bet on. And the other end of the spectrum is teams that can set up and be able to play very, very defensive and look to counter. So a team like maybe like a Canada or a Japan who are experienced enough and well drilled in sitting deep and looking to counter, because a lot of times what happens is some of these nations who are playing in, whether it be Africa or Asian qualifying, whether it be Saudi Arabia or Senegal or Cameroon, these teams are used to having possession against these smaller countries and being able to dominate matches. Well, now you're going up against the Brazils and the Spains and the Englands of the world. You're not going to have possession, and you're going to have to sit in a deep low block, and you're going to have to look to counter. And if you're not experienced enough to be able to do that, then that becomes a problem. So I want to, like Anthony already mentioned, tactics are a big part of international soccer and how teams set up. So if I'm looking to bet an underdog, I want an underdog that's very experienced at being able to sit defensively and can punish teams on the counter. Teams like Canada and Japan, like I already mentioned.
BJ, Anthony, as always, this was a very enlightening conversation. And if you want to hear more enlightening conversations between the 3 of us as we talk about the footy, talk about betting on the footy, all the pain that comes with betting on the footy, you can always listen to Wonder Goal, the soccer betting podcast from the Action Network. For Anthony Dabundo, for Anthony Dabundo, for BJ Cunningham, I'm Michael Leboff. We wish you the best of luck with all your bets in this World Cup.